Okay, so we want to understand then how human beings structure their societies and how they make life meaningful and how they see the world, and that's great. But turns out the majority of human beings who've ever lived aren't alive right now, right? And a lot of some things have been written down in writing. History is often written from biased perspectives of people that, as they say, writers write the history books. And in many cases, writings are missing, either because they've been destroyed, as in the case of many of the Mayan codices that were burned during Spanish imperialism in the area. Some areas never had writing to begin with. Major portions of the world weren't keeping written historical records because there wasn't writing. And then still other times you had writing, but only among the elite, and therefore huge parts of sort of what was going on in a community are invisible to us if we were to solely rely on what was being written. And so archaeology gets at all that. How do you uncover the cultures of the past? Some of times which were written about, a lot of times which were not. Because that's important. If we're going to draw conclusions about human cultures and say human cultures are like this, or human cultures develop hierarchy when this happens, or human cultures tend to be warlike under these conditions. Well, we could either study a sliver of humanity that's alive now, or we could study the whole chunk of all the different human cultures, right? It greatly expands our horizon of human cultures. So it's the study of human societies in the past. Well, how do you do that? Short of having, again, as I said last lecture, a TARDIS time machine and the ability to time travel, how in the world do you ever do this? Well, primarily through studying material remains, and also not just material remains. This can be a lot of different things. We study, or archaeologists study artifacts, so the things left behind by people, old stone tools, old glass tools, old metal tools, whatever the case may be, but old tools, the bones that people threw out from what they were eating, so we can figure out what they were eating, digging in the soil to find the pollen spores that people had so that you can get a sense of what they were farming at the time. So artifacts, trying to analyze the soil to see what the landscape was like at the time, so you can know, was this a forest back then? Was this a savanna? What was going on here? Digging up, ancient ruins, ancient houses, ancient cities, and getting to know those spaces, translating if there's writing which can be translated, or if not, trying to make your best possible educated guesses based on the artifacts and the cities and the shelters that you can find. All of that is archaeology, uncovering and piecing together the story of the past, trying to understand culture and community and historic change in the past. And it's an incredible and it's a beautiful thing that allows us to, in many ways, get back into the experience of people living hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of years ago. Of course, archaeology, like cultural anthropology, has kind of its key concepts. I'll mention a few. Artifacts, the things left behind. Ecofacts, the environmental conditions of a place and of its past that let us know kind of what was happening, right? If we know that a place used to be covered with ice in a certain time period, people probably weren't living there, right? So things that let us interpret the past. And features, things like ruins. So for example, here locally, you can tell Dena'ina homes, among other things, by some of the features. So archaeological record. This refers to the fact that basically the archaeological record is what we can know about the past through the things that are, in the ground, so to speak. And it's very important context there. As soon as you've removed something from the dirt, it's lost a lot of its informational value, because when it's still in the area where it was, we can figure out, okay, where was this close to? Was it close to a stream? Was it used for fishing? What is it found around? And also, what level of dirt is it in? We call that stratigraphy. How old was it? Carbon date the stuff around it, etc. So context is really important. With the archaeological record too, preservation is important, making sure that when we find information about our human past, our ancestral past, we don't just sort of destroy it or put concrete over it, but instead make sure that we're either preserving it or at least studying it, which is where you get into what's called cultural resource management, which is a field of applied anthropology where people go and try to study the archaeological record in cases where they think it might be destroyed or impacted by things like a road or a new building, going and digging ahead of the bulldozers, as they say. Archaeological record is a little like this funnel. We'll talk about this later in the class, in the sense that if this is all the stuff humans were up to 10,000 years ago, this is all the layers of where we lose stuff. We lose stuff because there's some stuff that just decays and we never find it. We lose some stuff because it's in a place where we didn't look. We lose some stuff because there's concrete on top of it, and so forth. So eventually we get a smaller chunk of the bigger total, but we are still able to use that to develop some very interesting hypotheses and theories about what was going on. Nowadays, archaeology has veered more towards working collaboratively with tribal institutions, with indigenous groups. Historically, there was a lot of unethical and shady research that was done, as I may have mentioned last time, not by all archaeologists certainly, but by some, including the way in which the remains of ancestors were dealt with, the remains of human beings. And so there was a law that was passed a couple of decades ago, 3 decades ago, here in the States, called NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, that among other things mandates a process of determining the ancestry of human remains that are in museums and were oftentimes taken unethically, not because a relative donated them, but stolen from the ground and then returning them to the people. Or, if the people so choose, keeping that in the museum, but having conditions under which that would occur. So that falls within a broader umbrella of ethnoarchaeology, archaeology where you talk to the communities that you're trying to understand the past of, because oftentimes people, even if there wasn't a written history, pretty much always have a detailed oral history, a story of where they came from as a people, which can oftentimes give us a lot of insight and understanding that we would never have if we were just trying to look at artifacts. So better research, both factually speaking and also morally or ethically speaking. There is another concept that you'll hear a lot in the next couple of lectures when we're talking about like Australopithecine and Homo habilis and these like early human-like creatures. We'll talk about the idea of a culture or a tradition, and we'll use that term a little bit differently than cultural anthropologists. What we mean by that when we're talking about archaeology is when there's a noticeable trend in what the artifacts look like at a specific time period. Like we might say, 200,000 years ago, all the objects we find from that time period all kind of look like this. So we call that a tradition or a culture that we're discovering. Okay, so key methods, as you kind of gathered from what I've been saying: surveying, going out and looking for things, surveying the ground, or using more advanced technologies such as LiDAR, which is like a laser sensing technology from planes. Other things that can be done as well, other kinds of techniques that are used. But surveying, first and foremost, kind of where it starts is surveying, getting to know a landscape, finding the places where there might be significant sites, testing them, and then excavating them if there are interesting things there, digging in the ground to discover what's there and to catalog it and to understand it. Oftentimes, stratigraphy or carbon dating become important so that you can, quote, date or age the site, figure out how old the site is. Geoarchaeology is another kind of method that gets used sometimes, sampling the soil to try to understand what people were up to back in the day. But at its core, archaeology is really a discipline of excavation, first and foremost, and cataloging. All right, let's talk a little bit now about linguistic anthropology. So linguistic anthropology shares a lot of overlap with cultural anthropology, and indeed, that makes sense because language is fundamental to culture. Culture doesn't exist without language, as we understand it. But linguistic anthropology, in a sense, all cultural anthropologists are looking at language, right? They talk to people and try to get at how they understand the world, which means language. But linguistic anthropology specifically kind of takes that to a whole new level and really delves into not just language as a means to an end, but language as an end to itself, trying to understand how language works and how it works in relation to cultures and to societies, how our cultural meanings shift our language, how our language shifts our cultural meanings, and how they're connected. So for example, studying to take as one example that I'm familiar with, studying Dead-Ganag, which is an Athabascan group here in Alaska, as Beth Leonard did, studying Dead-Ganag traditional narratives and trying to understand what that tells us about Dead-Ganag classic views of animal-human relationality, among other topics, and the significance of the raven, but also trying to understand that from a very word-centric perspective of how does the word pike relate to the word tree, and what does that tell us? So these very fine-grained analyses of language. I'm actually not sure if Beth Leonard got her degree in anthropology or in indigenous studies, so maybe I don't know if she would object to my using her as an example of this. I'm just very impressed by her research. But anyways, documenting and analyzing how language relates to cultures. I have here some pictures of, for example, several ancient Near Eastern scripts being compared and analyzed. That would be an example of linguistic anthropology. I have here an example of an equally important linguistic anthropology research topic, which is parts of the United States where people say soda, pop, or Coke to refer to the fizzy beverages that we drink in mass quantities. And so linguistic anthropology then is an interesting field. On an essential level, it's looking at communication in its broadest possible sense, that which is spoken, signed, written, and even our body language. Its main focus is really the ways in which societies use language to express and negotiate ideas and to shape social relationships and cultural ideas. So it can range from the very technical kind of descriptive side, such as, this is a paper by a guy called Gary Witherspoon that I read in grad school, how are objects of rest discussed within Navajo language of Denebazad? So very technical of what do the verbs look like and what do those tell us about underlying ways of thinking? It can also range to very applied practical questions of how do we best document this language, but also how do we best present it to people, maybe through a computer app or something, a smartphone app, so that an indigenous language that's endangered, that we can get more people speaking it. That would be a linguistic anthropology question. It's also just a linguistics question. And it also contains such profound thoughts as how does language shape how we think about the world? And it also includes a whole lot of so there's a side of it that's very descriptive and technical. There's also a side that's more what I call sociocultural or ethno-linguistic is what we call it, but basically looking at kind of bigger picture questions of how does culture relate to language? How does the way that we speak about nature as natural resources then relate to how people in the United States tend to think about land and land ownership? So fun stuff, interesting stuff. If you're interested in it, take my linguistic anthropology class. Some key concepts in linguistic anthropology. One of them is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or we sometimes call it linguistic relativity. The idea that language that is habitually used shapes how we habitually think. That language on some level shapes thought. We'll talk about that later in the class, and we'll see whether or not there's evidence for that. Whether or not, for example, if a culture does or doesn't distinguish between blue and green, does that actually affect how you visually perceive blue and green? You might be surprised. Some other big concepts within linguistic anthropology are language ideology, the idea that many people hold that some languages are better than others, or some kind of speech are better than others. You might be shocked right now and be saying, well, heaven forbid, I would never think that. But if you believe, for example, that swearing in front of your boss is unacceptable and unprofessional, that's an example of language ideology, right? So is the idea that certain kinds of speech are slang or informal and therefore shouldn't be in a term paper. So we're all exposed to language ideologies all the time. Language ideology is an important concept in this field. So is language family, looking at how languages are related to each other, how languages branch off from each other. Another big concept is endangered languages. It is predicted by linguists and linguistic anthropologists that up to 50% of languages could be lost by 2100. We are facing a global language crisis. If you happen to think that languages are an interesting part of our diversity, we are in the midst of a global language crisis, and there's a lot of different factors. And you might say, well, is that really a big deal? People, switch over to a big trade language like English or Mandarin or Spanish. Why is that? They still have a way to communicate. For linguistic anthropologists, they see language as connected to a lot of other things like identity and meaning and community, and that when languages are endangered, that can become problematic for people in a lot of different ways. And a lot of times people want to revitalize or reclaim their language and make sure that it doesn't go away. And so language anthropologists talk a lot about language revitalization. This is an example of that, by the way. This is a stop sign from Oklahoma, which is written in The Cherokee syllabary, which is a unique Cherokee writing system in the English writing system, or the Roman script, but the English writing system, and then also in sort of a the Roman alphabet, but then the in Cherokee phonetics. So anyways, and then semiotics is another big concept in linguistic anthropology, which is how do we make meaning? Why is it that the sounds k, a, t means this little furry feline? How does that come to be? So we will talk about that more later on. I'm sure you're all fascinated because cats are fascinating and awesome and way better than dogs. Just kidding. Sort of. So some of our key methods, descriptive linguistics, which basically means cataloging. I know this is just really surprising. Describing a language, its grammar, its vocabulary, its verbs, its nouns, how it works, and what we see is that they work tremendously different from each other, which is fascinating. We have a lot more different than you would think when it comes to language. Physical anthropology is sort of the story of how similar we actually all end up being. Linguistic anthropology is sort of how different we end up all being, how different our languages are. There's historical linguistics, which does things like glottochronology, or trying to determine language families, comparing languages side by sides and the words for certain objects to figure out which languages split from which languages when. And then sociolinguistics and ethnolinguistics, things like discourse analysis, breaking apart, like recording something. This is appropriate for today since it's Martin Luther King Day when I'm recording, but the looking at a discourse, in this case, the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., and looking at, this is something I did with a computer, so the writing's a little sloppy here, but circling out things that are from other pieces of texts, we call that intertextuality, like, you know, quotation from the Bible or something, noting parallelism, noting where people are using metaphors, noting where people are doing repetition, and what all that has to say about what a speaker is saying and what the audience is receiving. So discourse analysis. A little bit of a 3-minute history, kind of like I did with cultural anthropology, about linguistic anthropology.